If you still think Donald Trump controls every room he walks into, watch what happens when Whoopi Goldberg finally says no. Trump's hand came down flat on the table, not gentle, not theatrical. The sound of it was sharp enough that the camera in position 4 caught the vibration in the water glasses. Goldberg did not move. She had been sitting in the same position for the previous 7 minutes, spine straight, hands folded, eyes tracking him with the patience of a woman who has been in rooms with powerful men her entire professional life and has learned across decades that stillness is not the absence of power, but one of its purest expressions. Trump's mouth was open. His voice, which had been filling the studio for the better part of an hour, had arrived at the register it reaches when the words are running out, but the volume is being maintained as a substitute. High, insistent, thin at the edges, in the way that volume is thin when it has nothing beneath it. And then the producer in the control room gave the order that was 60 seconds too late. The commercial break hit, but the cameras had already captured everything they needed, and the footage was already uploading. To understand what had brought the room to that moment, you have to go back to the morning of the taping, to the green room, to the specific silence that the floor director would later describe as the most intentional quiet he had ever experienced in 22 years of live television production. You could feel it before you could name it, that particular quality of charged stillness that settles into a studio when everyone in the building knows something the audience does not yet know. The lighting crew had run their board check at 7:40. The floor director had adjusted his headset at 7:53 and not touched it again. The control room had 3 extra monitors active that morning that were not part of the standard broadcast configuration. Whoopi Goldberg arrived 40 minutes before the other hosts. She sat at the table in the empty studio with a folder in front of her that she did not open, her hands resting on the cover with the flat certainty of someone who has already read everything inside it and has decided that the reading was enough. The executive producer stopped in the doorway at 8:15, looked at the folder, looked at Goldberg, and left without speaking. Later, she would say she understood in that moment that whatever was inside the folder had already made the decisions for everyone in the building. Trump entered through the studio's main corridor, the route that delivers a guest to the table from the audience's right, the approach that gives the cameras the widest possible angle on the entrance, the approach that a man who understands cameras uses when he wants to be seen arriving. His walk was the walk of someone for whom arrival has always been an event, broad, unhurried, each step occupying its full share of the available floor. At the table, he paused. His hands went to his jacket, a brief inventory before the commitment. He settled into the chair with the completeness of something finding its lowest point, wide and certain, every inch of space claimed and accounted for. His eyes moved around the table, to Joy Behar, to Sunny Hostin, to Sarah Haynes, and then to Goldberg, where they stopped and held with the flat measurement of a man calculating whether the room knows it belongs to him yet. "Whoopi," he said, with the warmth of a man using a first name as a form of ownership. "You look—" Another pause, the same selection process. "Tired." The studio audience produced a sound that was not quite laughter and contained something closer to recognition. What followed over the next 22 minutes occupied the full architecture of a performance Trump had been delivering for decades, and delivered it with the fluency of someone who no longer needs to think about the material. He told the panel that The View was the most consequential show on daytime television, by virtue of the fact that he remained willing to appear on it, and that without his presence, it would decline to the level of a community meeting with better lighting. He told Goldberg specifically that her position as the show's senior voice was an artifact of longevity rather than authority, that there was a difference between having been somewhere the longest and having earned the right to speak from it. He moved to the relevance attack with the ease of someone reaching for a tool he has used so often it is worn to the shape of his hand. A performer, he said, whose cultural moment had passed its peak and was now operating on the residual heat of a reputation built in a different decade. He arrived at the power claim with the unhurried certainty of long repetition. He ran rooms, ran outcomes, ran the national conversation in ways that every person at that table existed inside without acknowledging the source of the current. He finished with the dismissal. "You need me here more than I need to be here," he said. "That's just the math." A woman in the studio audience turned her head toward the person beside her and said nothing. Goldberg had not moved. Her hands had not moved. She had received every word at the same steady remove, not absorbing it, not deflecting it, but simply declining to be organized by it, which is a different and more difficult thing The silence she placed after his final sentence was not social silence. It was the silence of a woman who has heard this exact architecture before and knows precisely which stone to remove to bring it down. When she spoke, her voice arrived lower than anything she had used in the broadcast to that point. Not louder. Lower, weighted, deliberate, with the quality of something that has been held at the right temperature for exactly the right amount of time. "You keep talking about power," she said, "but power doesn't usually need this much defending." One beat, two. Then she opened the folder. You could feel the shift in the room the moment the folder opened. A change in the air that was not quite temperature and not quite pressure, but something that lives between the two. The specific atmospheric quality of a space in which the balance has been permanently altered and everyone present has registered it simultaneously. She placed the first item on the table without rushing. A printed document. She described it before displaying it. Public record. A formal legal proceeding 7 years prior in which Trump had made 4 specific factual claims under oath about his business practices, about his financial relationships, about specific transactions, about the nature of his involvement in decisions that were later the subject of extended judicial examination. She named the proceeding, she named the date, she named the case number, then she placed the document face up on the table and let the cameras find it. Trump's jaw shifted. His right hand came off the armrest. He said the proceeding had been a politically motivated action by a compromised judicial system, that the claims he had made had been contextualized incorrectly, that anyone who understood how legal depositions worked would understand that language of that kind required professional interpretation and not literal reading. Goldberg looked at him steadily. "The transcript is certified and unredacted," she said. "We have the court verification on file." A woman in the second row stopped moving in her seat. She stayed that way. Then Goldberg reached under the table. She lifted a second folder, heavier than the first, with a tab system along the right edge, the color coding visible to the front rows as organized rather than decorative. She placed it on the table and opened it to the first marked section. Inside, a cross-reference document compiled by an independent research firm, mapping each of the 4 deposition claims against the publicly verifiable record. Financial filings, corporate registrations, transaction records, court exhibits from related proceedings. 4 claims, 4 documented realities. The distance between the column on the left and the column on the right was not subtle, not ambiguous, not a matter of interpretation. It was arithmetic. Trump interrupted before she had finished the second entry. Goldberg paused, waited for the interruption to exhaust itself, and continued from the exact word where she had stopped. He interrupted again at the third entry. She paused again, waited again, continued again. The studio audience made a sound at the third pause. Not laughter, not commentary, simply the audible acknowledgement of a pattern becoming visible. Trump's left hand moved toward the folder. Goldberg placed her palm flat on the cover without looking up. "One more," she said. The camera caught the withdrawal of his hand. The front row caught it. A man near the center of the studio pressed both hands flat against his own knees. The screen on the studio's rear display changed. A timeline, a visual record of the same 4 claims, mapped across public appearances, rallies, press conferences, interviews, social media posts, dating from 2017 to the present. Each instance plotted against the documentary record compiled in the cross-reference. The claims had not changed in 7 years, not in emphasis, not in detail, not in the specific figures cited. They had repeated exactly across every available platform and venue, in the face of a documentary record that had been publicly available for the entirety of that period. Trump talked over the timeline. His voice rose to fill the visual space the screen was occupying, building volume in the way volume is built when it cannot actually address what it is trying to cover. Goldberg did not raise her voice. She slowed down. She let the silence between her words carry what the timeline was already holding. "This is the infrastructure," she said, looking between the screen and the folder and Trump. "Not of a misunderstanding, not of a dispute." She looked at him directly. "The infrastructure of something that was built to stand up." She let it sit for one breath. "And I'm showing you where the foundation is." Nobody at the table spoke. Nobody in the studio spoke. The floor director near the back of the set stood with his clipboard held flat at his side in a way that was not his standard posture and was not a decision, but simply the result of a decision becoming irrelevant. The audio file came next, captured in a private setting, forensic certification visible on the lower right of the studio monitor, voice match confirmed against 3 reference samples. Trump in a post-meeting conversation, speaking in the unguarded register of a man who believes the room belongs entirely to him. The content was 4 sentences. In the first, he he referenced one of the 4 deposition claims directly. In the second, he described the documented reality of that claim in terms that contradicted the deposition statement precisely and explicitly. In the third, he used the phrase, "Nobody looks that far back." In the fourth, he laughed. Goldberg let the recording finish. She let the silence after it hold for 5 full seconds, long enough for every person in the studio to have absorbed the 4th sentence and everything it contained. Trump said it was fabricated, manufactured, a product of the media apparatus that had been targeting him with increasing desperation as his dominance became undeniable. Goldberg placed the certification report on the table beside the folders. She did not read it aloud. She turned it face up and oriented it toward the camera for 7 seconds. A woman near the back of the studio pressed her closed hand against her mouth. A door near the production corridor opened. A man, former senior compliance officer for one of the corporate entities named in the deposition claims. He had worked in the role for 9 years. His testimony was procedural. What his responsibilities had been, what documents had passed through his review, what the documents had shown, and what had happened when his review had produced findings that contradicted the public position his organization was maintaining. He spoke with the precision of someone who has been storing language in a specific sequence for a long time and has found, finally, a place to release it. He said he had arrived at the studio 2 hours early and sat in a coffee shop around the corner, ordering water. He did not drink, going over the dates in his head, not because he might forget them, but because the act of going over them was the act of deciding one more time that this was the right thing. Trump called him a low-level functionary with an old grudge dressed up as professional obligation. The man absorbed the characterization without visible response. "Fear doesn't age well," he said, not looking at Trump, looking at the folder on the table. "It turns into something heavier, and I'm done carrying it." The second witness came through the same door 90 seconds later. A woman who had served as a documentation coordinator for a legal team retained during the period covered by the deposition. She had worked directly with the materials at the center of the cross-reference document. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement. She said so, and then she continued. Her voice held for one full moment before the first sentence. A visible gathering, the jaw settling, the hands in her lap closing against each other until the knuckles reached a color that the front row could see without straining. She named the documents. She named the specific discrepancies she had flagged during her review, the flags that had been removed from the record, and the instructions she had received about how to process material that produced findings inconsistent with the organization's public position. When Trump rose from his chair and said, "You are betraying a professional relationship that was built on trust," she looked at him with a stillness that was not blank but full. The stillness of someone who has already paid the price of this moment and found it preferable to the price of the alternative. "They didn't buy my silence," she said. "They rented it, and the lease just expired." The studio did not erupt. A man in the far left section, back row, aisle, brought his hands together once, deliberately, with the specific rhythm of someone producing a sound rather than performing one. A second person joined from across the room, then a third from a different section entirely, as if the response was not spreading through the audience but arriving simultaneously in multiple places, converging rather than cascading. The studio filled with it. The slow, deliberate, real sound of hands coming together because words had become insufficient and sitting still had become impossible. Trump was still standing. His breathing was visible before it was audible. The chest operating at a rate his posture was working to conceal, the effort itself readable in the rigidity of the shoulders. His hands had found the table edge and were gripping it with a force that left the skin at the knuckles pale. His eyes had stopped settling, moving between the documents, the screen, Goldberg, the cameras, the space behind the cameras, and finding no surface that offered what they were looking for. A line of perspiration had appeared at the hairline and had not been wiped away. His jaw was clenched in the specific way jaws are clenched when the alternatives are worse. His voice, when it came back, moved through the familiar stations. Fabricated, coordinated, a media operation dressed as accountability. His attorneys were engaged. He had survived worse. He was still here and still dominant. And the real record would vindicate everything, and everyone in the room would owe him an accounting they did not have the character to deliver. His hand came down flat on the table. The water glasses vibrated. Goldberg did not move. She looked at him across the table with the patience of a woman who has been in rooms with powerful men her entire professional life and has never once confused their volume with their authority. She let the hand on the table sit there, let the silence after it gather and thicken and become the room's primary weather. Then she said, "If this is all fabricated, then show the truth, not with insults, with evidence." She did not look away. "Everything is on this table. Everything is on that screen. 2 people came through that door." A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "Your move." Trump's mouth opened. The control room gave the commercial order, but the cameras were already on his face, and the face was not producing speech. The floor director had his headset pulled half off his head, suspended there, the motion of replacing it abandoned in the middle of its own completion. A camera operator in position 1 held her lens on the empty expression for 16 seconds after the order came through before she finally cut. The footage had already left the building. Within 8 minutes, the first clip was live. Within 26, the broadcast had been cut into 13 independent segments, moving across platforms at velocities that the network's monitoring system logged as a category event. The 2 folders on the table, the deposition cross-reference, the compliance records, were reproduced side by side on 4 network broadcasts before midnight, without commentary. The columns presented as their own sufficient argument. The word infrastructure appeared as a segment title on 3 platforms and as a standalone caption beneath the frozen image of Goldberg's hand flat on the folder cover. Trump's counterstatements arrived in sequence, measured, then longer, then louder, then operating in full capitals with the desperation of volume and text that cannot carry the weight volume in a room can carry. Each statement was screenshot and placed beside the specific clip it was denying. Goldberg, still, composed, hand on the folder. Trump, escalating, fragmenting, multiplying, exclamation marks. The comparison required no framing. Forums cross-referenced the deposition case numbers, the compliance officer's employment records, the documentation coordinator's NDA registration date. The lawsuits did not materialize, the counter-documentation did not arrive, and the control room order that came 60 seconds too late became, in its own right, part of the story. Because what it confirmed was the one thing it was trying to prevent, that for 16 seconds on live television, a man who had spent 4 decades filling every room he entered with the sound of his own certainty had nothing left to say. If this changed how you see power, hit subscribe. If it didn't, watch it again. The details you missed the first time are the ones that matter most. Notifications on. Next one drops soon.